My dad found a new family after my mother died, but my dad's new wife wanted me to take down all the photos of my mom from the walls. When I didn't agree, my dad did it instead and kicked me out. I think it's time, Jane said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, heart pounding. The photos of her, your mother, they need to come down. This isn't her home anymore. My breath hitched. She wasn't asking, she was telling me. And deep down, I knew my dad would listen. And why Mom died when I was 12. One day, she was helping me with a school project at the dining table, her laughter echoing through the house, and the next, she was gone, taken by a stroke so sudden it felt like the universe played a cruel trick. My dad and I didn't know how to live in a world without her. We fumbled through those early days, speaking in whispers and avoiding her empty seat at the table. He poured himself into work, and I poured myself into anything that could numb the ache: books, music, late-night journaling sessions where I pretended she could still hear me. But nothing filled the silence that her absence left behind. Every corner of the house held her memory, and for a long time, it was the only comfort we had. But 5 years later, when I was 17, Dad found Jane. Jane moved into our home exactly 5 years after my mom died. My dad met her through a coworker, and within months she and her 2 kids, Logan and Emma, were living with us. I didn't have time to adjust or prepare. One day it was just my dad and me, and the next, I had to share my home with strangers. Jane made herself comfortable quickly. She changed the curtains, replaced the pillows on the couch, and rearranged the kitchen cabinets. She didn't ask for my opinion, and my dad didn't seem to care. Her kids, Logan and Emma, were noisy and took over the house. Logan, 10, liked to come into my room and touch my things, my headphones, my books, even my mom's music box. Emma, 8, cried whenever she didn't get her way. The peace that my dad and I had shared for years was gone. Jane didn't like the reminders of my mom. At first, it was subtle. She'd glance at the framed pictures on the wall, or the vase my mom had picked out, and I'd see the tension in her face. "We should repaint this room," she said once, while looking at the wall where my mom's favorite photo hung. "It's outdated." Another time, she suggested replacing the old wooden dining table, the one my mom had insisted on buying because it reminded her of her childhood. It wasn't just about redecorating. Jane wanted to remove my mom's presence from the house entirely. She became especially irritated when my dad and I talked about my mom. If I mentioned something small, like how my mom used to make pancakes on Sundays, Jane would shift in her seat and force a smile. Once, during dinner, I brought up a story about a vacation we had taken with my mom. Jane cut me off mid-sentence, saying, "That's nice, but we're building new memories now." She tried to hide it, but I could tell she didn't like hearing about my mom. It made her feel like she was living in someone else's shadow. One night, I overheard her talking to my dad. "I'm not saying we forget her," Jane said, "but this house feels like a shrine to the past. It's like I don't have space to exist here." My dad didn't argue with her. He just listened. That's when I knew she wasn't just uncomfortable, she was jealous of my mom. Jane wanted to take her place. It all came to a head one evening when Jane cornered me in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when she sat down across from me. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the kind of voice someone uses when they're about to ask for something they know won't be well received. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," she began. I looked up, bracing myself. "I think it's time we make this house feel like a home for everyone. Your dad and I agree that keeping the photos of your mom all over the walls isn't healthy. We need to create space for new memories, don't you think?" I felt my heart drop. I knew this moment was coming, but hearing her say it out loud hit harder than I expected. "What's wrong with the photos?" I asked. My voice was steady, but I could feel the anger bubbling underneath. "They're everywhere," she said, gesturing around the room. "I understand that she was important to you, but it's been 5 years. I need to feel like this is my home too, not just a reminder of someone else's life." I stared at her, struggling to find the right words. "Taking down the photos doesn't erase her," I said. "She's still a part of this family." Jane sighed, like she was tired of having to explain something so obvious. "It's not about erasing her. It's about moving forward." You have to understand how difficult it is for me to live in a house that constantly reminds your dad of someone else. I'm not trying to hurt you, but we need a fresh start. Her words made my stomach churn. I knew she wasn't being honest. This wasn't about a fresh start. This was about her insecurity, her need to erase any trace of my mom to feel like she had full control of the house and my dad. I shook my head. I'm not taking down the photos. She pressed her lips into a thin line and stood up. Think about it, she said before walking away. I didn't have to think about it. I knew I wouldn't take down anything. But Jane wasn't the type to back off easily, and I knew this conversation wasn't over. The next morning, I found my dad in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like it was any other day. But I knew it wasn't. Jane must have talked to him after our conversation. I sat down across from him, waiting for him to bring it up, and sure enough, after a few minutes, he lowered the paper and looked at me. Jane told me you two had a conversation last night, he said. His voice was calm, but I could sense the weight behind it. Yeah, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me too. But maybe she's right. Maybe it's time to take down some of the photos and make the house more balanced. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad, the man who used to sit with me and cry over those same photos, was asking me to erase them. Balanced? I said, my voice rising slightly. How is removing everything about Mom balanced? You're just giving Jane what she wants. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his elbows on the table. She's not asking for much, he said. She just wants to feel like this is her home too. She moved in. She changed the furniture. Her kids took over the house. What more does she need? I tried to keep my voice from shaking, but the frustration was too much. This is the only part of Mom I have left, and you want to take that away too? My dad exhaled and looked down at the table for a moment before meeting my gaze again. I'm not trying to take anything away from you, he said. But we have to move on. Jane's a part of this family now, and we need to make sure she feels like she belongs here. She already feels like she belongs. I'm the one who doesn't. I shot back. Silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. For a brief moment, I thought he might change his mind, that he might see how much this meant to me. But instead, he stood up, finished his coffee, and said, We're taking them down this weekend. You can help or I can do it myself. My chest tightened. You can't be serious. He didn't respond. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving me sitting there, staring at the empty chair where he had been. I thought I had time to fight back, time to convince him to change his mind. But I was wrong. The next day, I came home from school and saw the empty walls. The photos, the frames, the memories, everything was gone, and that's when I knew. My dad hadn't just taken down the pictures. He had taken Jane's side. After the photos came down, it felt like a switch had flipped. Jane didn't waste time filling the empty spaces, new family portraits with her kids front and center, generic artwork, and decorations that matched her style. The house no longer reflected the life my dad and I had before she arrived. It felt like I was living in someone else's home, and it didn't take long for that feeling to spread into every part of my life. The tension between Jane and me only grew. It wasn't just about the photos anymore, it was everything. She started criticizing the way I did things, from how I cleaned my room to how I spent my time after school. You should be more involved with Logan and Emma, she'd say. They look up to you. But I didn't want to be involved. I wanted my space back. Logan was constantly in my room. No matter how many times I told him to stay out, he'd still sneak in and mess with my stuff. One day, I caught him going through my mom's old jewelry box, the one I had hidden in my closet. I yanked it out of his hands and shoved him out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Minutes later, Jane was pounding on the door. Don't you dare yell at him like that, she said when I opened it. He was touching my mom's things. I replied, my voice shaking. You don't have to be so aggressive, she snapped. He's just a kid. He doesn't understand. He understands boundaries. He just doesn't care. Jane crossed her arms and stared at me for a moment before shaking her head and walking away. My dad didn't even ask what happened. He just told me to try to get along. Emma was another problem. She was spoiled, and Jane let her get away with everything. If Emma threw a tantrum because she wanted something, Jane gave it to her. One night, I was watching a movie in the living room when Emma came in and demanded the TV. When I refused, she screamed so loudly that Jane came running. Without even asking for my side of the story, Jane handed her the remote. "Just let her watch her show," she said, like I was being unreasonable. I stopped trying to fight back. I stayed in my room as much as I could, avoiding the living room and kitchen unless I had to eat or grab something. Even then, it wasn't easy. Jane's kids were always there, fighting over toys, leaving their messes everywhere, and taking over every inch of space. I missed the quiet evenings when it was just my dad and me sitting on the couch, watching TV and eating popcorn. Now, I felt like I didn't belong. It wasn't just the noise or the disruptions. Jane started making decisions that directly affected me without asking for my input. She reorganized the kitchen and threw away some of my mom's old cookware, calling it outdated. She moved my things in the bathroom to make room for her products and Emma's bath toys. She even switched my bedroom furniture around while I was at school, saying it was for a fresh look. I came home to find my bed on the opposite side of the room and my books packed into boxes. I hated it. When I told my dad, he shrugged. "It's just furniture," he said. "Don't make a big deal out of it." I wanted to scream. It wasn't just furniture. It was another reminder that this wasn't my home anymore. Even meals became a source of conflict. Jane cooked dinner most nights, and I quickly realized that she had no intention of keeping my mom's recipes alive. My mom used to make my favorite dishes, mac and cheese with bacon, homemade chicken pot pie, but Jane preferred her own recipes, and my favorites were forgotten. When I asked if we could have one of my mom's old meals, Jane brushed it off. "Maybe another time," she said, but that time never came. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. My relationship with my dad was strained. He was always busy with work or helping Logan and Emma, and whenever I tried to talk to him, he'd tell me I was being too sensitive or that I needed to give Jane a chance. But I had given her plenty of chances, and she kept pushing me further away. The house was suffocating, and I didn't see a way out. I didn't realize how close we were to breaking until the night everything came crashing down. I had come home late from school after staying behind to work on a group project. When I walked through the front door, the sound of laughter hit me. Jane's kids were running around the living room, shouting over the blaring TV. Jane was in the kitchen, chatting with my dad while they prepared dinner together. They barely noticed I was home. I went straight to my room, hoping to avoid them, but the moment I opened the door, I froze. My mom's music box, the one Logan had been caught touching, was gone. I searched frantically through my closet, under my bed, and in the drawers where I had hidden it before, but it was nowhere to be found. My heart pounded as I stormed into the living room. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the noise. Everyone stopped and stared at me. "What are you talking about?" Jane asked, sounding annoyed. "The music box. My mom's music box. It's gone." Jane sighed and exchanged a glance with my dad. "I put it in the attic," she said, as if it were no big deal. "It was just sitting there collecting dust. I thought it would be safer in storage." "You had no right to touch it," I said, my hand shaking. "It's just a music box," she replied, her voice calm but condescending. "You're overreacting." "No, I'm not," I snapped. "It's one of the last things I have of her, and you put it away like it's junk." My dad stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off. "Let's not do this," he said quietly. "We've talked about this before. We have to move on." "Move on?" I laughed bitterly. "You already moved on, Dad. You replaced her. You let Jane take over this house and push out every memory of Mom. I didn't agree to any of this." Jane's face hardened. "I'm not trying to replace your mom," she said, her voice icy. "But this isn't just your home. It's our home now, and we all need to feel comfortable here." I looked at my dad, waiting for him to defend me, to say something that would make this nightmare stop. But he didn't. He just stood there silent, like he always did. I felt something snap inside me. "If this is your idea of a home, then I don't want to be here anymore," I said. "I can't do this." Jane crossed her arms. "Maybe it's for the best," she said, her tone cold and final. And my dad flinched, but he didn't argue with her. Instead, he lowered his head and said the words that would haunt me for years. "If you can't accept the changes, maybe it's time you find a place where you can." The air left my lungs. My own father had just asked me to leave. I didn't even say goodbye. I turned around, went to my room, packed a bag with the essentials, and walked out of the house without looking back. I walked down the street with my bag slung over my shoulder, unsure of where I was going but certain I couldn't stay. I ended up at my best friend's house, where his parents didn't ask questions. They offered me the couch, and that night, I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the argument in my head. And why Dad had chosen Jane. He had chosen a new family over the one we used to be. The realization hit me harder than I expected. For 5 years I had held on to the belief that no matter what, my dad and I were in this together. We had survived the worst loss of our lives, losing my mom, and I thought that bond was unbreakable. But it wasn't. The next few days were a blur. I went to school, tried to focus, and ignored the texts and calls from my dad. At first, he asked if I was safe. Then, he started asking when I'd be coming home. I never responded. Home didn't exist for me anymore, at least not the one I remembered. A week later, I returned when I knew no one would be home. I let myself in with my key, heading straight for the attic. Dust clung to my fingers as I rummaged through boxes until I found what I was looking for, the music box. I cradled it in my arms like it was a lifeline, then packed the rest of my mom's belongings I could carry, old photos, her favorite book, and a few trinkets she had collected over the years. I didn't take anything else. The house felt like a stranger's, and I didn't want any part of it. Before I left, I walked through the living room one last time. The walls were covered in new photos, Jane smiling with my dad, Logan and Emma posing by the fireplace. I barely recognized the place. There wasn't a single trace of my mom left. As I closed the door behind me, I realized something. My dad had made his choice, but so had I. I wasn't going back. I moved in with my best friend's family temporarily while I worked part-time and saved up for my own place. Over time, I stopped wondering if my dad regretted kicking me out. Maybe he did, or maybe he was too far gone in his new life to notice I wasn't there. Either way, I didn't care anymore. The memories of my mom weren't tied to that house. They lived in the items I had taken with me and the moments we had shared. And wherever I ended up, she would be there too,